The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had decided that what the galaxy truly needed was a beauty pageant. Not just any beauty pageant, mind you, but the intergalactic convention of aesthetic excellence, held aboard the gleaming space station Vanitas Prime, a name that either displayed remarkable self-awareness or a complete lack thereof depending on one's perspective on cosmic irony. Vanitas Prime floated in the neutral zone between 17 different star systems, its chrome and crystal surfaces reflecting the light of distant suns like a cosmic disco ball. The station's designers had clearly subscribed to the more is more school of architecture, cramming every surface with holographic displays, bioluminescent art installations, and enough mirror panels to make a narcissist weep with joy, which, coincidentally, was exactly what was happening in the main convention hall. The delegates had gathered from across the known galaxy, each species convinced they represented the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary aesthetic achievement. The crystalline collective had sent their finest geometric specimens, their faceted bodies refracting light into rainbow cascades that could blind a lesser being at 50 paces. The Floral Federation's representatives swayed gently on their root feet, their petal faces opening and closing in mesmerizing patterns that released pheromones capable of inducing temporary euphoria in most carbon-based life forms. Even the Blob Consortium had managed to sculpt their gelatinous forms into something vaguely resembling classical sculpture, though the effect was somewhat undermined by their tendency to jiggle when they moved. But towering above them all, quite literally, as he stood nearly 3 meters tall, was Blazethol of the Unsanian Empire. If Darwin had designed a peacock with delusions of grandeur and access to advanced biotechnology, the result might have resembled Blazethol. His crystalline skin caught and refracted light in ways that would make a prism jealous, shifting through spectrums of color that most species couldn't even perceive. His elongated limbs moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted his own magnificence, and his 4 eyes, arranged in perfect symmetry across his angular face, surveyed the gathered delegates with the sort of benevolent disdain usually reserved for particularly dim house pets. The Unsanians had long held themselves to be the galaxy's gift to aesthetics, and Blazethol was their finest export. His species had spent millennia perfecting their genetic code, eliminating every perceived flaw, until they achieved what they considered absolute physical perfection. They possessed immune systems so advanced that disease was merely a theoretical concept, healing abilities that could regenerate entire limbs, and a lifespan that stretched across centuries. More importantly, least in their opinion, they were devastatingly, undeniably, insufferably beautiful. "My dear fellow beings," Blazethol announced, his voice resonating through the convention hall with the sort of melodious tone that suggested he practiced his speeches in front of mirrors, which, knowing Zensanians, he probably did. "What a delightful gathering this is. Though I must confess, the competition appears to be rather limited this cycle." He gestured gracefully toward a cluster of Aquatic Alliance representatives, whose gill slits fluttered nervously under his attention. "Not that there's anything wrong with scales, of course. Quite charming in their own primitive way." The assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably. Insulting other species at a beauty convention was rather like criticizing someone's cooking while eating their food. Technically permissible, but socially questionable at best. Near the back of the hall, almost hidden behind a group of particularly enthusiastic fungal collective spore clouds, stood a lone human delegate. Echo Hartwell appeared to be the sort of person who could blend into a crowd of 3, possessing that peculiar human talent for occupying space without demanding attention. She was neither tall nor short, neither broad nor narrow, with brown hair that defied any attempt at classification beyond hair colored and skin that suggested she spent most of her time indoors, possibly reading dense scientific journals. The only remarkable feature about Dr. Hartwell were her eyes, an unusual shade of violet, that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. They were the sort of eyes that suggested either genetic modification or a really exceptional contact lens subscription, though her overall appearance suggested the former was more likely than the latter. She watched Blazethol's performance with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly colorful but predictable chemical reaction. Her expression remained perfectly neutral as he continued his subtle demolition of every other species present, though those violet eyes seemed to track his movements with increasing focus. "Of course," Blazethol continued, warming to his theme like a singer hitting his stride, "physical beauty is merely the outward expression of inner perfection. Superior genetics, advanced immune systems, optimal neural development. All of these manifest in aesthetic excellence. It's really quite scientific when one considers the correlation between evolutionary advancement and visual appeal. A few delegates actually nodded at this, apparently buying into the logic that prettier somehow equated to better. The ornamental order of Epsilon Eridani preened their feathers appreciatively, while several members of the perfectly symmetrical society adjusted their postures to better catch the light. Dr. Hartwell remained motionless, though her violet eyes had begun to narrow slightly. It was the sort of expression that on a human face typically preceded either a resignation letter or a particularly devastating scientific paper that would be discussed in academic circles for decades to come. Blazathol, oblivious to the gathering storm clouds in the back of the room, continued his impromptu lecture on the correlation between beauty and evolutionary superiority. He was, after all, a Zensanian, and Zensarians had never met a mirror they didn't like or an opportunity for self-aggrandizement they couldn't see. The universe, meanwhile, continued its slow rotation, cosmic forces aligning in ways that would soon remind everyone present why pride, as the ancient Earth saying went, typically preceded some rather unfortunate falls. If there was one thing the universe had taught sentient beings over the eons, it was that pride had a way of writing checks that reality was all too eager to cash. Unfortunately, Blazathol had apparently missed that particular cosmic memo, possibly because he was too busy admiring his own reflection to pay attention to universal constant. The Zensarian had found his rhythm now, pacing across the convention hall's central platform with the confident swagger of someone who had never experienced a moment of self-doubt. His crystalline skin caught the overhead lights in ways that created spontaneous light shows, and he seemed to time his movements to maximize the effect. Several delegates had actually begun shielding their optical organs, though whether from the glare or from second-hand embarrassment remained unclear. Take, for instance, the fascinating case study of evolutionary mishaps. Blazathol continued, gesturing toward a group of insectoid collective representatives, whose compound eyes were currently glowing with what could charitably be called restrained annoyance. These charming creatures have maintained their basic form for millions of years. Admirable consistency, really, though one does wonder why they never felt compelled to improve. The lead insectoid delegate's mandibles clicked in what was probably not applause. Undeterred by the growing tension in the room, or perhaps energized by it, as narcissists often were, Blazathol moved on to bigger targets. The Aquatic Alliance found themselves subjected to a lecture on the limitations of gill-based respiratory system. The Crystalline Collective received a patronizing discourse on the aesthetic superiority of organic crystal formation over their rather rigid geometric pattern. Even the gaseous entities weren't spared, though insulting a sentient cloud of particles required a special kind of creativity that Blazathol seemed to possess in abundance. And then he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering the punchline to a joke he found particularly amusing, "We have our human representative." Hartwell, who had been observing the proceedings with the patience of someone accustomed to sitting through particularly tedious academic conferences, suddenly found herself at the center of galactic attention. If this bothered her, she gave no sign of it. Her violet eyes remained fixed on Blazathol with the sort of steady focus typically reserved for specimens under a microscope. Humans, Blazathol announced as if he were revealing some profound truth, represent one of evolution's most fascinating experiments in mediocrity. No specialized adaptations to speak of, no particular strengths, no remarkable beauty. They're rather like the galaxy's participation trophy, present, but not particularly impressive. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, the sort of polite laughter that accompanied jokes nobody really found funny but everyone felt obligated to acknowledge. The diplomatic corps of Centauri Prime shifted uncomfortably in their seats, having learned through centuries of interspecies relations that laughing at one species in front of another was generally poor form. But Blazathol was just getting started. "I mean, look at her," he continued, gesturing toward Dr. Hartwell with the sort of casual dismissiveness one might use when pointing out a particularly unremarkable houseplant. Perfectly average height, unremarkable coloring, no distinctive features whatsoever. Even those eyes, clearly some sort of cosmetic modification, because nature certainly wouldn't produce anything so garish naturally. Dr. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. It was subtle, the sort of change that might go unnoticed unless one was watching very carefully. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and her hands, which had been clasped loosely behind her back, moved to her side. The truly remarkable thing about humans, Blazethal continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who had found their favorite subject, is their complete lack of natural immunity to most galactic pathogens, fragile immune systems, laughably short lifespans, and a tendency toward genetic diseases that more advanced species eliminated millennia ago. It's almost endearing, really, like watching a species try very hard to survive despite being spectacularly ill-equipped for the task. The laughter was getting more uncomfortable now. Several delegates were actively looking away, suddenly finding the station's art installations fascinating. The Empathic Council's representative had actually begun emanating waves of distress, their emotional sensitivity picking up on the growing tension in the room. Why, I heard that humans are still struggling with basic genetic disorders that we Xantharians conquered before we achieved spaceflight. Blazethal pressed on, oblivious to the way the room's atmosphere was shifting from amused tolerance to something considerably more hostile. Immune deficiencies, cellular degeneration, susceptibility to viral mutations. It's remarkable they've managed to survive long enough to join the galactic community at all. Dr. Hartwell took a small step forward. Just one step, but it seemed to carry the weight of intention behind it. And the irony, Blazethal announced, spreading his arms wide as if embracing the cosmic humor of it all, is that they actually believe they have something to contribute to galactic civilization. As if a species that can't even cure its own common cold could possibly offer anything of value to races that have achieved true evolutionary perfection. That did it. The change in Dr. Hartwell's demeanor was like watching a switch being flipped. One moment she was the unremarkable human delegate, content to observe from the sidelines. The next she was something else entirely, still calm, still composed, but with an energy that suddenly made the room feel several degrees colder. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through Blazethal's monologue with the precision of a surgical laser. "I believe there may be some inaccuracies in your assessment." Her voice was quiet, controlled, with the sort of dangerous calm that suggested she was choosing her words very, very carefully. The kind of calm that preceded either profound wisdom or spectacular destruction, and sometimes both. Blazethal paused mid-gesture, apparently surprised that his audience had found their voice. His four eyes focused on Dr. Hartwell with the sort of amused condescension, typically reserved for children who had interrupted adult conversation. "Oh?" he said, his tone dripping with mock interest. "Please do enlighten us with your perspective." Dr. Hartwell smiled. It was not a particularly warm smile. The universe, meanwhile, continued its ancient dance, cosmic forces, aligning in ways that would soon remind everyone present that sometimes the quietest voices carried the loudest truths. There are moments in galactic history when the universe holds its breath, when cosmic forces align in ways that transform the mundane into the momentous, the ordinary into the extraordinary, when a single sentence can reshape the understanding of entire civilizations and leave egos scattered across the void like debris from a particularly spectacular starship explosion. This was about to become one of those moments. Dr. Hartwell stepped fully into the light, her unremarkable human form suddenly commanding the attention of every sentient being in the convention hall. The chatter died away as if someone had activated a universal mute button, leaving only the gentle hum of the station's life support systems, and the increasingly nervous sound of Blazethal's crystalline skin chiming as he shifted his weight. "You mentioned my eyes," Hartwell began, her voice carrying the sort of calm precision that suggested she was about to dissect something with surgical accuracy. "You're quite right that they're the result of genetic modification, though I suspect your assessment of the reasoning behind that modification might be somewhat limited." She paused, allowing her violet gaze to sweep across the assembled delegates, before returning to focus on Blazethal with laser-like intensity. Several delegates unconsciously leaned forward, suddenly aware that they were about to witness something significant. "These eyes," she continued, raising one hand to gesture delicately toward her face, "are indeed artificial. Specifically, they're the result of a targeted genetic modification, designed to enhance certain optical proteins, and improve cellular resistance to specific types of radiation damage. Blazithal's expression suggested he was waiting for the punchline to what he assumed was an elaborate joke. His 4 eyes blinked in perfect synchronization, a sure sign that he was about to deliver what he undoubtedly considered a devastating comeback. "Practical," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Leave it to humans to modify themselves for purely functional reasons, rather than aesthetic improvement." Hartwell's smile widened slightly, and somehow this made her appear considerably more dangerous than any overt threat could have managed. "Oh, but you see, that's where you're mistaken. The modification wasn't for practicality in the general sense. It was for survival, specifically survival against the Xerian plague." The reaction was immediate and profound. The crystalline collective delegates began chiming in harmonized distress. Several gaseous entities started swirling in agitated pattern. Even the perpetually composed diplomatic corps straightened in their seats, their trained poker faces cracking under the weight of sudden realization. The Xerian plague was not a topic discussed in polite galactic society. It was the sort of historical catastrophe that entire species preferred to pretend had never happened, filed away in the same mental drawer as embarrassing family secrets and regrettable fashion choices from one's youth. Blazithal's complexion, impressive as it was in its crystalline perfection, began to shift toward colors that didn't exist in any aesthetic spectrum. The sort of colors that suggested internal systems experiencing what humans might call significant technical difficulty. "The Xerian plague," Dr. Hartwell continued with the relentless precision of someone presenting data to a scientific review board, which emerged approximately 73 years ago from certain experimental research facility. Research that was attempting to create enhanced biological weapons through accelerated viral evolution. She paused to let that sink in, her violet eyes never leaving Blazithal's increasingly horrified face. Research conducted, if memory serves, by Xerian scientists who believed their superior immune systems made them uniquely qualified to work with dangerous pathogens, who were convinced that their evolutionary perfection rendered them essentially invulnerable to biological threat. The silence in the hall had taken on a quality that transcended mere absence of sound. It was the sort of silence that occurred when universal constants were being challenged and found wanting, when carefully constructed worldviews were encountering inconvenient facts and losing the battle spectacularly. "The plague," Hartwell continued, her voice maintaining that same calm clinical tone that suggested she was discussing weather patterns rather than galactic catastrophe, "killed approximately 40% of all sentient life in this sector of the galaxy. It was particularly effective against species with what you might call advanced immune systems, those that had been so perfectly tuned over millennia that they couldn't adapt quickly enough to a rapidly mutating pathogen." Several delegates were now actively avoiding looking at Blazithal, who had begun to emit a high-pitched harmonic that suggested his crystalline structure was experiencing stress fractures. "Xerian casualties," Hartwell noted with the sort of careful precision that suggested she had memorized these statistics for exactly this moment, "approached 68% of the total population. Quite remarkable, really, considering how advanced your immune systems are supposed to be." She turned slightly, addressing the broader audience while keeping Blazithal in her peripheral vision, like a scientist monitoring a volatile experiment. "The plague was eventually contained and cured. Of course, though I suspect most of you remember the process being rather surprisingly so, considering the complexity of the pathogen and its resistance to conventional treatments." Heads began to nod around the room. The Aquatic Alliance's gills fluttered in what might have been nervous recognition. The insectoid collective's compound eyes glittered with what was definitely dawning comprehension. 3 months, Dr. Hartwell said, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation. "From identification to cure. Rather impressive, wouldn't you say? Especially considering that the most advanced medical facilities in the galaxy, Xerian medical facilities, had been working on the problem for over 2 years without significant progress." Blazithal made a sound that might charitably be described as a whimper. Though coming from a 3-meter-tall crystalline being, it was more like the sound of expensive glassware experiencing catastrophic structural failure. "The cure," Hartwell continued with relentless precision, "was developed by a small team of human researchers,
working out of what was essentially a converted warehouse on a backwater planet that most of the galaxy couldn't even pronounce correctly. Humans with their fragile immune systems and primitive understanding of genetics. She turned back to face Blazethul directly, her violet eyes now blazing with an intensity that made it clear why genetic modification had been necessary to achieve that particular shade. "These eyes," she said, pointing once more to her face, "are proof of immunity, not cosmetic enhancement, not aesthetic preference, but biological evidence that I survived direct exposure to a pathogen that your evolutionarily superior species created and then couldn't cure. A pathogen that would have killed me in approximately 72 hours, if not for the work of those same mediocre humans you've been so eloquently dismissing." The convention hall had achieved a level of silence typically reserved for the vacuum of even the station's life support systems seemed to have quieted in deference to the magnitude of what was being revealed. Dr. Hartwell's smile took on a distinctly predatory quality. "So yes, Ambassador Blazethul, my eyes are indeed artificial. They're a monument to human ingenuity, a testament to the survival capabilities of a species you seem to consider genetically inferior. They're also a reminder that sometimes the most unremarkable-looking beings in the galaxy are the ones who end up saving everyone else from extinction." She paused, tilting her head slightly as if considering her next words very carefully. "Including you." The sound that emerged from Blazethul's crystalline form was unlike anything the galaxy had previously catalogued in its extensive database of sentient being distress calls. It began as a high-pitched harmonic whine, evolved into something resembling the death song of a particularly melodramatic wind instrument, and culminated in what could only be described as the sound of 3 meters of genetically perfect being, discovering that perfection was a relative concept, and he had been graded on the wrong curve. His magnificent crystalline skin, which had been refracting light in spectacular displays just moments earlier, was now cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known aesthetic spectrum. Muddy browns, sickly greens, and a particularly unfortunate shade that looked remarkably similar to the color of embarrassment. If embarrassment could be weaponized and fired from orbital platforms. But we are the pinnacle of evolution," Blazethul managed to stammer, his 4 eyes blinking in patterns that suggested his neural processors were experiencing what humans might politely call a critical system error. "We eliminated genetic weakness millennia ago. We achieved perfect biological harmony. We are alive," Dr. Hartwell finished gently, "because humans figured out how to cure a plague your species created but couldn't solve. Yes? We've established." The other delegates were beginning to shift uncomfortably, and not just because they were witnessing what amounted to a 3-meter-tall cosmic ego, experiencing rapid unplanned disassembly. Something else was happening in the convention hall. A ripple of recognition that suggested Hartwell's revelation had triggered a galaxy-wide case of sudden memory recovery. The Aquatic Alliance's lead delegate cleared her throat with a sound like water flowing over polished stones. "Actually," she said, her gill slits fluttering with what might have been embarrassment, "since we're apparently sharing our current respiratory system modifications, the ones that allow us to process both aquatic and atmospheric oxygen with perfect efficiency." Hartwell turned toward her with the sort of polite attention that suggested she already knew what was coming. "Human bioengineering," the aquatic delegate admitted. "After the great atmospheric convergence nearly wiped out half our species, your people developed the hybrid lung-gill system in about 6 months. We'd been trying to evolve a solution for 3,000 years." A nervous chittering arose from the insectoid collective's section. Their lead representative's compound eyes were glowing with what was definitely embarrassment now. "Our improved hive communication network," she clicked reluctantly. "The quantum entanglement system that allows instantaneous thought sharing across galactic distance. Human quantum biology research." Dr. Hartwell nodded. "Adapted from studies on Earth's mycorrhizal networks. If I recall correctly." The confessions began to flow like water through a broken dam. The crystalline collective's advanced light processing capabilities, Human optical engineering. The gaseous entities improved cohesion matrices that prevented them from dispersing in stellar winds. Human plasma physics. Even the perfectly symmetrical society's ability to maintain their geometric forms in varying gravitational fields turned out to be based on human mathematical models.
Thule was now emitting sounds that suggested he was experiencing what could charitably be described as an existential crisis of galactic proportions. His perfect crystalline form had begun to develop actual stress fractures, thin lines of imperfection running across his previously flawless surface like cracks in the foundation of his entire worldview. "This is impossible," he managed to whisper. Though given his size, his whisper carried across the hall like a confession broadcast on emergency frequencies. Humans are primitive, genetically inferior, aesthetically unremarkable. They can't possibly be responsible for most of the biological and technological advances that have allowed your superior species to survive the last century, Dr. Hartwell suggested helpfully. "Oh, but we are. You see, that's the thing about being genetically inferior. It makes you remarkably good at adaptation. When you can't rely on perfect immune systems or millennium-long lifespans, you have to get creative. You have to think outside the evolutionary box." She gestured around the room, her violet eyes taking in the assembled delegates with something that might have been affection, if affection could be mixed with scientific curiosity and a dash of cosmic irony. "Every species here has something that makes them remarkable, something that makes them beautiful in their own way. But that beauty, that specialization, can also be a weakness. Perfect immune systems that can't adapt to new threats. Crystalline forms that fracture under stress. Geometric perfection that breaks down in gravitational anomalies." Her gaze returned to Thule, who was now leaning against a support pillar for stability, his perfect posture having apparently abandoned ship along with his ego. "Humans, on the other hand, are remarkable precisely because we're unremarkable. We're the galaxy's generalists, the species that learned to survive by being adaptable rather than perfect. We're beautiful because we're survivors. And we help others survive because that's what survivors do." The convention hall had achieved a new quality of silence. Not the horrified silence of cosmic revelation, but something deeper. The thoughtful quiet that occurred when beings were forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the universe and their place in it. Hartwell smoothed down her hair-colored hair and adjusted her perfectly average clothing. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "I think you'll find that true beauty isn't about perfect symmetry or flawless genetics. It's about the courage to help others, the wisdom to solve problems, and the strength to survive disasters, even disasters caused by those who consider themselves perfect." The Empathic Council's representative began emanating waves of something that felt remarkably like respect mixed with admiration. The diplomatic corps exchanged glances that suggested rapid recalculations of humanity's position in galactic society. Even the Blob Consortium had managed to sculpt their gelatinous forms into shapes that looked suspiciously like applause. Thule, meanwhile, had achieved a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, and was making sounds that suggested his vocal processors were experiencing the biological equivalent of a system crash. The convention's moderator, a diplomatically neutral AI that had been observing the proceedings with the sort of detached interest typical of artificial intelligences, chose that moment to announce the results of the delegate voting, a process that had apparently been ongoing throughout the entire exchange. "Ladies and gentlemen and non-binary sentient beings," the AI announced, its voice carrying the sort of professional neutrality that suggested it had been programmed to handle awkward social situations with grace. "The results of the Intergalactic Convention of Aesthetic Excellence delegate voting are as follows." The hall held its collective breath, or equivalent respiratory function. By unanimous decision, the title of Most Beautiful Delegate goes to Echo Hartwell of Earth, in recognition of what the voting delegates have described as the most stunning display of intellectual beauty, survival grace, and cosmic justice ever witnessed at a galactic beauty convention. Hartwell blinked her artificially violet eyes in what appeared to be genuine surprise. "That's unexpected," she said, with the sort of understatement that suggested she had mastered the human art of diplomatic modesty. Thule made a sound like crystal wind chimes being fed through a matter transporter during a severe malfunction. His perfect form began to fold in on itself, as he attempted to make himself as small as possible, which, considering his 3-meter height, was rather like watching a skyscraper try to hide behind a lamppost. As the other delegates began to approach, Hartwell, with what could only be described as newfound respect and a healthy dose of curiosity about human bioengineering capabilities, Blazet Thule began the slow process of extracting himself from the convention hall. His exit was accomplished with the sort of dignified retreat typically associated with military forces that had discovered they were fighting on the wrong side of history. The universe, meanwhile, continued its ancient rotation, cosmic forces settling back into their usual patterns with what might have been satisfied amusement. The laws of physics remained unchanged, but the social dynamics of galactic civilization had just undergone what historians would later describe as a significant recalibration event. Hartwell found herself surrounded by delegates eager to discuss collaboration, to share stories of human assistance they had previously been too proud to acknowledge, and to perhaps revisit some of their assumptions about genetic superiority and evolutionary perfection. As she fielded questions about human research capabilities and survival strategies, her violet eyes occasionally glanced toward the exit where Blazet Thule had made his retreat. There was no malice in her expression, no triumph over a defeated opponent. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like hope. The hope that even the most perfect beings in the galaxy might eventually learn that true beauty lay not in flawless genetics or superior evolution, but in the courage to admit imperfection, and the wisdom to accept help from those who had learned to survive by being beautifully, magnificently, unremarkably adaptable. The Intergalactic Convention of Aesthetic Excellence would be remembered for many things, but perhaps most of all for the moment when the galaxy learned that sometimes the most beautiful beings were the ones who looked the most ordinary, and that survival, as it turned out, was the most stunning aesthetic achievement of all. Somewhere in the neutral zone between 17 star systems, cosmic justice had been served with a side of delicious irony, and the universe was well pleased with the outcome.